Hiya all, Rick here with a video that's a little more of a discussion or opinion piece. I'm not going to get into a debate about what is canon, what shows in what timeline, because that gets messy and is outside the purview of this video. What I want to talk about is the importance of stories and lore that lie outside of the shows, material that never makes it into the series, yet builds out the world and the immersion of the fantastical worlds of Star Trek. Beta content. In Star Trek, it's widely accepted that the shows represent the canon of Star Trek's universe, although ever since the original series, even they occasionally contradict themselves, an inevitable outcome of such a long-running franchise and a multitude of different authors all tailoring the universe to tell a narrative they want to portray. First off, I guess it would be good to define what beta content is in terms of Star Trek. As far as I can tell, the name is drawn from Memory Beta, a website which is a cousin to the Memory Alpha one. Complicated naming conventions apply even to the Phantom Zone creations, it seems. Memory Alpha gets its name from the in-universe institution that hoards the collected knowledge of the Trek universe, and, just like its fictional counterpart, the site seeks to catalogue all the information pertaining to the canon of the shows. Memory Beta, therefore, seeks to accumulate everything else, from sources beyond the shows, books, games, comics and so forth. In videos, I use the term beta content, apocrypha and external materials interchangeably because that's pretty much what it is. It's everything else official outside of the shows. Now, Star Trek has always had the approach that if it is not on screen, it is not canon, and therefore subject to be overwritten or contradicted at the whim of the next televised episode. Personally, I do wish it was otherwise, but I understand why it's not feasible. Trek is not as large as something like Star Wars, who's able to monitor their cross-media storytelling, more or less to make sure it all still lines up. I like this approach, and with the relaunch of Star Trek Discovery in 2017, there was a brief effort to assuage fans that the new content coming out, like books, would all be considered in continuity with the shows. This has sort of not exactly come to pass, with some narratives still adding to the storylines of the shows, while others end up with contradictions. So basically, nothing changed. The veracity of external material is still subject to the whims of the next main series author. That all being said, it's still an important part of the overall Trek universe that deserves to be acknowledged and explored, and here's why. One of the better implementations of behind-the-scenes lore that I'm aware of are the near-mythological lore bibles, used by shows with expansive universes. These are effectively indexes of reference materials derived to create a behind-the-scenes consistency with dates, characters, technobabble and locations, etc, etc. For the next generation era of shows, there was a concise effort to create jargon for things like how the transporters worked and warp drive, often even drawn from real-world theories and concepts. Some may say it's futile to compile such information, after all this is made up anyway, but it helps maintain immersion in a thought-out, reasonable world that the characters we are invested in inhabit. Across the series of Next Gen, DS9 and Voyager, information could be shared behind the scenes and individuals working on the shows could swap around easily, making a concise universe easier to enforce. A warp drive worked one way. Dilithium crystals served one function. Transporters needed the buffer system and Heisenberg compensators and so on. But even in this best case example, we see that even these do not hold up against the might of the needed plot. Transporters are said to freeze you in place before you beam, unless Reginald Barclay needs to grapple a ghost. You're converted to energy and reconstructed, you're not a duplicate, until we want a story with two Rikers. Which is another reason for beta content. It's often there to rationalise away mistakes or oversights created by the main shows for their own plot's sake. Now, yes, these exceptions are then justified with more tech stuff, but that only exists to make these narrative choices possible. But overall, Maintaining a semblance of background consistency leads to a point where you can reference past technology when talking about it on screen. We don't need a full on-screen breakdown of how Transporter works in canon, all in one scene with diagrams explaining the function of every circuit. But if such a diagram exists behind the scenes, it makes it more believable. Such a diagram can even be made public knowledge later as reference materials for fans to pore over, and this is often the case with Starship reference manuals and LCARS displays. Schematics and ship layouts are not always required for every scene on the show, but they can be alluded to for world building. There is a double-edged sword in this approach, however, and that is, once a background detail of how something works is made canon, it is subject to greater scrutiny when the laws around it are suddenly violated. For this reason, there are only vague maps of the Star Trek Milky Way, with distances not disclosed, and even the best warp speed charts are approximations based on mentioned dialogue. This sort of vagueness helps mask things like travel times being unbelievable. You cannot say that Cardassia to Romulus can't be done in 2 days, if you have no speed, nor distance, to refute it, despite most interpretations agreeing that they lie on completely opposite borders of the Federation. But the hunger of the fanbase to see and know these things remains, and eventually speculative maps make the rounds, and even licensed materials like star charts and games end up having to generate maps to make sense of the Trek galaxy. These maps are highly detailed and well thought out, but end up making some large and concrete assertions that the shows would rather ignore, because ignoring them allows them to maintain that leeway for the plot's sake. But when a map is needed as background set dressing in an admiral's office, there is one from Star Trek Online that is pretty accurate and will do, paradoxically including it in live action while also ignoring the implications it brings to light. For example, the STO map places Earth and Sector 001 as pretty much on the border of the Alpha and Beta quadrants. In fact, in-game it's technically on the Beta half of the map, despite canonically being in the Alpha quadrant. So, what's the workaround here? Well, to say that Kronos, Romulus and so on were always set in the Beta quadrant, but because of their activity they are still considered Alpha quadrant powers. This is a big assertion that flies in the face of prior Trek shows that reference their locations on screen, and such examples are only one of many that could occur should a map be made 100% confirmed true. But maps are only one example of sweeping changes. Both Star Trek Online and, say, the Star Trek Destiny series, the latter retroactively set in the first Splinter timeline, they have large narratives that spell major changes to the landscape of the Trek universe. Spoilers ahead for these, but for example, in the Destiny timeline, the origin of the Borg is revealed to be at the accidental hands of the Kaliar. Not only this, but the Borg are then subsequently entirely defeated and removed from being a threat, forestalling any future involvement of them. In Star Trek Online, many plot points that were left unanswered from TNG are picked up once again, and it's explained that the Iconians were actually behind a lot of things, returning from hiding after 200,000 years to conquer the galaxy. What follows is a galactic-scale war that sees the birth of the Kismet alliance between the Klingons, Federation Romulans, and even parts of the Dominion and other powers. A major shake-up, not to mention a devastating loss to Starfleet's forces. Thing is, the narrative of Star Trek Online is one that is well thought out, and draws on the lore set up in the shows to spin a connected tale. However, the universe that it creates, while still a Trek-flavoured one, is unequivocally one where conflict is rampant and has been for a while. Where the game picks up, the Klingons and Federation are back at war. The Cardassians and Romulans both have splinter movements that resume hostile actions on Starfleet, and Species 847-2 and the Borg are both making plays into the Alpha Quadrant. It's a great setting for a game, but not exactly a TV series for Trek, or at least not a series that aims to capture the heart of Star Trek, as it were. Rather than disregard these external tales, however, I think it provides a good opportunity to explore what-if scenarios, especially with the latest popularity of multiverses, something that has been technically canonical to Trek forever, always eager to explore science fiction ideas. This means that all these tales, therefore, could be considered canonical to a larger Trek multiverse, and indeed, that is the approach that the first Splinter timeline and, as of 2023, Star Trek Online have taken. These tales can even act as inspiration, or even provide background knowledge to things for even the show's creators. One recent example that comes to mind is the name of Number 1, the first officer of Captain Pike, being Una Chin Riley. This was drawn from a book. The first one I read with it mentioned was Legacy's Book 1, Captain to Captain. When it became apparent that she was going to be a needed player in a live-action series, at some point the choice would have been made to either embrace extra-canonical sources or make it up on the spot for the shows. Electing to do the former adds a sense of legitimacy to any lore established externally to the shows. If that name is now fact, what else could be drawn into the shows and incorporated? Likewise, mentions in Star Trek Discovery of the Iconian remnants in the 32nd century might not have been done as a conscious reference to Star Trek Online's apparent survival of the Iconian people, but again, it alludes to other elements of that series making their way into the shows, not to mention the numerous starship designs and Enterprise F. It could be said that including these elements is merely done because of laziness or because it's easy, but I'm not so sure. Sure, porting a starship from one medium to the other still requires a little refinement, but overall, that's easier to do. However, adding an entire or adapted lore is not necessarily easy. It needs to be adapted to fit, especially if the tales have diverged. To use Starship examples again, because we're already on it, the Enterprise F launch dates had to be brought back by around 20 years at least, and its entire mission profile would have to be wiped. In the canon of the shows, we know that it existed and was an Odyssey-class star cruiser, and we know its retirement date. Even its specs and reason for being decommissioned are technically beta content, and therefore subject to revision. It's a similar deal with characters, and we can see the one-way street of canon in effect. The Enterprise continuation books treat the entire series as history to their setting. Of course they do, it's continuations. But then the events they continue are not fed back into the timeline of the shows. We know there was a Romulan war. We know that nukes were used, and that Romulans were never seen in the flesh during the conflict. We know it led to the formation of the Federation, but all the details, the Warp 7 race, the actions of Trip Tucker, the reasoning for the lack of Andorian and Vulcan involvement, all this context is only found in the books. While canonising the books would be a shortcut to adding in this lore, it might also bring in unexpected results and mentions as discussed earlier. But what it can do is act as a source of inspiration where bits and pieces, references and dates can be sifted through and selectively dropped into future shows, or at least kept in mind while something is being developed. This is a more complicated process than just writing it off, but it does less damage to the integrity of a show than wholesale adding in external books from over a decade ago. We've even seen the selective canonising of conceptual designs, like the refit Enterprise, which is brilliant. But then that means these books, which make no mention of the NX refit designs, are now in conflict. Beta Canon serves several purposes, and gets treated with fickleness by the shows. But that's fine. It can act as a behind-the-scenes context, which makes for a consistently portrayed universe for fans, and even the production teams. But its implementation wholesale can lead to a destabilisation of that narrative. Ultimately, It's there to provide entertainment and support the primary medium of the main productions. It would be nice for there to be the occasional piece of media that receives the proper badge of approval as relevant but not pivotal background. But even if this happens, it tends to be only for as long as it is convenient. On a personal note, I find it's a shame to let these extra tales, stories and lore pass the fanbase by, which is pretty much the whole reason I include it in my videos, so that fans of Star Trek can at least take a look at the additional lore and just keep it in mind when examining the shows. Yes, it's annoying when something I enjoyed or even made is overwritten by the next series, but that's just a risk we take when we start thumbing through a new Trek book or install a new game. Thanks for watching this discussion ramble on how beta content is treated. If you could port something over into the continuity of the shows, what would it be? I've been Rick, and I'll see you again next time for another video. Until then, goodbye.